thrilled to have Doug Sims, who's the Director and Senior Advisor at the Green Finance Center and Resilient Communities, Healthy People, and Thriving Communities program at NRDC. We have Caitlin McCoy, who's a Climate, Clean Air, and Energy Fellow for the Environment and Energy Law program at Harvard Law School. And then we have Karl Ludwig, Schibel, Senior Fellow and National Coordinator for Italy at the Climate Alliance of European Cities. And then from our own FES, we have Professor Ken Gillingham, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at both the Forestry School and the School of Management, and he's going to be moderating our event. So thank you all so much for coming.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to kick off what should be a fantastic conference. And we're really fortunate to have a set of truly excellent panelists here in our first panel. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. What we're going to do is give each of the panelists a little bit of time first to talk about their experiences, and they each have a wealth of experiences in different areas on this topic of cities and mitigating climate change. And then we'll move to, I'll kick it off with a question or two, and then we will see how the conversation goes. But I would really like you all to think about questions so that we have a chance to engage you all in the conversation as well. So there'll be a good opportunity for you to ask questions as well. With that, why don't we start off? Caitlin, would you like to begin with any thoughts that you have? A few minutes of thoughts first.
Okay, it's not too late. I'm going to begin my remarks with a brief refresher on the general structure of authority between our federal government, state governments, and local governments, and then I'll spend the rest of my time talking about some of the discrete areas that I work in and how state and local governments can undertake work to reduce greenhouse gases with a low risk of federal intervention. So first, of course, I feel like we have to do this perfunctory look back. It's worth remembering that our environmental laws that we have today really came to be at a federal level in the 1970s. It was previously a local exercise. And each of our major federal environmental statutes has its own cooperative federalism structure, often where the states have the ability to adopt more stringent standards. Now, we've seen that balance of cooperative federalism shift over the last 3 years. The federal government has taken some actions to roll back standards at a federal level, but also in some cases take away states' ability to adopt their own standards and targets. So states that have policies that are in this cooperative federalism world, but also states with their own independent climate policies, are increasingly acting more defensively than we've seen in the past, and thinking carefully about how they can protect their regulatory programs from federal intervention. Some states, or some cities, might also need to think defensively, depending on the politics of the state that they're located in. So all of this brings me to my quick overview, and it brings us to the 10th Amendment. As we all know, the 10th Amendment reserves any powers not given to the federal government, to the states, and to the people. And that's important because those powers are expressed through our doctrine of state police powers, which we can think of broadly as the ability of states to enact and enforce laws for the promotion of public health, safety, and the general welfare of their residents. These state police powers are the basis of local climate laws. And so it's important to understand how states do or don't share those powers with their local governments. And they do so in a few different ways. One is through a rule called Dillon's Rule, and one is under another framework called Home Rule. And in many states, there's a hybrid of both at play, actually. So Dillon's Rule is more restrictive. It says that a municipal government can only exercise the powers expressly delegated to it by the state. And so it can also exercise some powers that are necessarily implied by those express powers as well. Home rule is a little more expansive, and it can be difficult to define because it's really different in each jurisdiction. But essentially, it's a way that states have given municipalities a certain amount of autonomy to create their own governments and take action in all the areas that are not occupied by statewide policy. So even though we have Dillon's Rule, which is more restrictive, Home Rule, which is more expansive, they're really two sides of the same coin, which is to say a way for states to figure out how much authority local governments have. Coming into the areas that I work in, you will notice the electricity sector is missing. And that's because my colleague at the Environmental and Energy Law program, Ari Pesco, works on energy exclusively, running our work there on that. So I focus on everything else. So that means I look at building energy codes, transportation, zoning and planning, and also urban forestry and organic waste diversion and composting. So these are all areas of traditional state control that fit within that stronghold framework of state police powers. So I basically try to trace the boundaries of these state and local authority as I kind of laid out to figure out where are the limits for actions that only the state can take, or where are there opportunities for localities to go ahead and take action as well, and what might the limits on those actions be. So today I'm just going to use one brief example, and then I'll wrap up and give time for all of us to talk, but we can talk about other areas during question and answer. I'll just mention building energy codes briefly. So the building sector is really important, and I think it's starting to be in the news a little more often. There was a big New York Times piece this week on building electrification, which was exciting to see. But here in the US, buildings use about 40% of the electricity that we produce, and they're responsible for 30% of our nationwide CO2 emissions. That comes from combustion, both inside of the buildings of fossil fuels, but also from the energy used in the operation of buildings. And so that means that buildings are often the largest part of a city's greenhouse gas footprint. So there's a real opportunity there to make reductions, especially because buildings have really long lifespans. A commercial building usually has a lifespan of 50 to 90 years. So states and local governments have authority over building codes as part of their police powers, as I mentioned. And they can adopt things like energy efficiency requirements and performance standards for both residential and commercial buildings. And local authorities may have some authority in this area as well. So they might be able to do things like adopting stretch codes or reach codes, which go beyond a statewide building code if there is one in place. In some states, all the building codes are just left to the local government. Or they may be able to adopt different codes entirely, depending on how permissive the state is and what that structure of state and local authority looks like in a given state. So I'll just wrap up with 3 examples of concrete policies. We know what works in this area. It's just a matter of bringing it to bear in as many jurisdictions as we possibly can. And one thing that we know that works is progressive standards that steadily improve over time. California is a fantastic example of this. They started adopting building energy efficiency standards in 1977, and they update them on a 3-year cycle. And every 3-year cycle, they improve about 12 to 15% in efficiency, which is really impressive. And states and cities can also lead by examples with strict standards for their own public buildings, right? So maybe there's a little less political blowback if they're just bringing really, really strict standards to bear on their own construction. And that is something that states and cities can do and have done. And two more things, cities can also tackle the difficult issue of existing buildings. This is a big one, retrofitting our existing buildings to be as efficient as possible. That can be done with specific programs targeting existing buildings, particularly large commercial buildings. But that can also be done using provisions inside the energy code to trigger a whole building upgrade once a renovation passes a certain cost threshold or square footage threshold. So there are different ways to do that. And then the last one, I think I only said 3, but I'm going for 4, which is the one that's very much been in the news, which is banning natural gas in new construction. And so this reduces some of the emissions from the combustion that we have inside of buildings, using natural gas for heat, for cooking, and also for certain appliances. But it also has other co-benefits, like improving the air quality inside of buildings. And we know there's a lot of upstream methane emissions associated with bringing all that natural gas into cities and distributing it so widely. There's a lot of leakage. So that also has some interesting climate co-benefits along with it too. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions eventually.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. That was there's a lot of food for thought there, and I already have some questions that I'm excited to ask. But before that, let's move on to our next. So, Karl Ludwig Schibel, is that pronounced correctly? Schibel, thank you. Please, go ahead. Do you have some slides? Lexi, you're amazing.
Yeah, actually, if you just want to pass this down.
I can definitely do that. So press forward and see how it goes. Wonderful.
There we go.
All right. You just flip it on.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm grateful and honored to have been invited here this afternoon. I'm thankful to Lexi Smith, who took care of us the last days and weeks, to Timothy Mason, who has been accompanying my visit here. I'm Karl Ludwig Schibel from Climate Alliance of European Cities. That is a network which I've been part of the presidency for a long time, 25 years, and continue to coordinate the cities and towns in Italy. I said them, it's 1,700 cities. It's 20% of all citizens in the European Union live in Climate Alliance cities. It's a European network. You may have heard of other networks, Energy Cities, Local Agenda 21, ECLAY, C40. Us, we are a European network. Our members take a commitment. They commit themselves to reducing CO2 emissions 10% every 5 years. And the other is the collaboration with the indigenous peoples of the rainforest in the Amazon region, which is not our subject here this afternoon. So we are interested in cities as actors. There are many actors in the field. I mean, this might be one point of discussion. I'll get at that. There are many actors in the field. There are the United Nations, there's the World Bank, there's the Pope, there's the European Union, there are social movements, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion. There are environmental associations, Greenpeace, unions, churches. Local governments are one actor, but, and that might be a discussion, they are not a dependent variable of other actors. Yeah? They are an actor in their own right. So closing the gap, meaning what the national governments are not able to do when they commit themselves in the wake of the Paris Agreement to the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to look at cities that they should then, as auxiliary troops, contribute to fulfilling those commitments of the nation state, in my view, is a top-down way of looking at things. It instrumentalizes cities. Cities are places where people live, where they work, where they participate in public life, where children go to school, where young people go to university. What is the job of local governments? To guarantee that the city is clean, that it's safe, that there are good health and social services, a functioning transport system. New Haven is wonderful. Urban green areas, a favorable environment for the economy. That's what city governments are about. And this is my thesis. I don't have a slide for that thesis. I don't know yet how to put that into a slide. The job of city governments is to guarantee a sustainable local development. And where does climate protection come in, which is a voluntary commitment of our cities? I argue that actions in favor of a sustainable local future are nearly identical with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we are not talking about where they are not identical. And I conclude by giving you some idea what we are doing with our member cities, or what we encourage them to do. 10,000, oops, that's too far. 10,000 cities in the context of the Covenant of Mayors, an initiative of the European Union, have elaborated sustainable energy action plans. And my city, Città di Castello, last Monday, I think, January 30, the City Council voted for the commitments for 2030 to reduce by 40% their CO2 reductions, which, as a member of Climate Alliance, is anywhere their obligation. The Città di Castello and many other cities, Città di Castello is my city in central Italy, is monitoring their CO2 emissions by since 2012. So they are aware of that the building sector is 40%, mobility, what is the relative importance? Because, many cities in Europe have been monitoring their CO2 emissions since 1990. They work on energy efficiency, renewable energy, very important, the municipal buildings and the energy efficiency in their own buildings, as you said before, Kathleen. And this is something we are working on intensively. How do you finance that? How do we develop projects? Sustainable mobility. Città di Castello has a sustainable urban mobility plan with the wonderful acronym SUMP. There it is PUMS because it's Piano Urbano di Mobilità Sostenibile. The involvement of the citizens, the participation, and this is the final point where I'll take a moment more. What I'm arguing in favor of is to mainstream climate protection, the reduction of CO2 emissions as one guiding variable into the daily functioning of the city administration. So we are also talking about the Office for Climate Protection. But for example, this is an example from Osnabrück, and I'll be glad in the breakout session or if there's interest to explain that better. Every deliberation of any of the offices, be it culture or social services or procurement or city planning, whatever goes to be decided in the city council You have to see if it's financially viable, if it's legal, if it's technically okay, and you have to indicate its relevance for CO2 emissions. If they are negative, and it has to pass through the Office for Climate Protection, who then will propose to you if it's negative, the emissions, how to do better. If it's positive, how to still do better. This is what I mean by mainstreaming climate protection into the daily functioning, not some dramatic extra activity which is added to my workload. In Chia Castello, I'm working for Ring, that was the Sustainable Mobility Plan, for a ring for bicycles and pedestrians around the historic center. And originally the head of the Urban Development Office, when I proposed that, called me a Boy Scout, meaning bicycles are for youngsters, they are for fun, but they are not a legitimate means to getting from A to B. Now it's in the plan. I hope it will work. Why will it work? Because you get to places quicker, it's cheaper, it's healthier, and it reduces CO2 emissions. Nobody is going to take a bike to save the climate. But you will take a bike and you feel very good that it also saves the climate. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Again, I have several questions for you, but I'm going to hold my tongue until we have Douglas Sims from NRDC to tell us about his views on climate mitigation.
Hey everybody, Doug Sims, NRDC. I'm going to tell you a little bit about sort of my background in NRDC and how we're approaching some of these problems, how we've evolved, and then get into some discrete issues at the city level about implementation and financing of these changes. And then hopefully later we can talk about some of the more macro issues that are between federal and state and global financing of these changes. So my background is law. I was an infrastructure lawyer for many years, went to the Harvard Law School, not this is August institution. And the reason why I became an infrastructure lawyer was because I wanted to work in infrastructure and development in emerging markets and be able to pay my loans off. So, but what I discovered in working in emerging markets in particular, even going back, 10, 15 years ago, was that you're already seeing some of the impacts of the current infrastructure system. You're seeing that a lot of these countries in Africa where there's, a plentiful renewable energy resources, still trying to build pipelines from Nigeria to buy gas. You're starting to see more intensive, or either droughts, and a lot of the flooding was already happening. And so I was really front lines representing the lenders and the governments on these large projects, and reading the environmental disclosures of these projects, where their impacts were quite large on the environment. So because of that, I pivoted to try to find a way to impact that infrastructure system in a more positive way. At the time when I stepped into the NRDC, the renewable energy was just really starting to take off in Europe and the US. And so the focus of the work that I do there is to plug into NRDC's sort of other more traditional methods of litigation, policy advocacy at the state, local, federal level. Combine that with an overlay of sort of looking at financing, the private markets, specifically how the private markets and the public sector interact around this issue of, you can call it sustainable infrastructure, you can call it climate smart infrastructure, you can call it, low carbon and resilient infrastructure. It's the class of things which includes buildings, because buildings, even if they're private buildings, are a major consumer of energy. They can be producers of energy. So how do we look at the whole built environment and move it towards a more sustainable future? So the question is ultimately always, how do you pay for it, right? So how do you pay for it? Because there's reasons why it may or may not be more expensive. So the classic reasons are that in the cases of things like early stage renewable energy, solar 10 years ago, wind 15 years ago, electric vehicles, batteries now, offshore wind a few years ago, you know, the upfront costs are more. And if you look at the whole system in the U.S. about how do we pay for this stuff, it's pretty different. I have a couple numbers I wanted to bring out, but if you think about the only sector which is really private sector driven is the energy sector. Energy generation is largely financed directly or indirectly by private investors. The transportation system, the highway system in particular, is lion's shares from the federal government. Everything else is financed by local government and cities. And you know, that means the water systems, that means some parts of the energy systems, that means many mass transit systems that are not interstate systems. That means all the public buildings. That means, you know, bike, everything, right? So, and unlike the federal government, you know, as Caitlin was saying, there are not just restrictions in the powers of local governments in terms of what they can regulate, but also how they can spend and raise money. Unlike the federal government, states can't generally run a budget deficit. States can't print money, nor can cities. So they're really constrained by what they can do. And what you see over time in the macro situation is that as the federal government sort of pulls back from a lot of the social welfare spending, things like healthcare actually are increasing, which actually makes the pie smaller for things like infrastructure. So they're really squeezed, local governments, how they finance these things. So that's sort of and then we have the situation where you're asking city and local governments to actually find additional money to pay for low carbon development and to pay for resiliency, because many places are experiencing, you know, extreme weather, and so this stuff costs more. Now it's true that as some of these things scale up, you know, the costs come down. We're seeing that now with batteries. You know, the solar trajectory was very quick, and also there's some savings, and this is the critical part for, I think we should get into how savings play in, because certainly in the case of energy, you are reducing, you have zero fuel costs for the most part with solar and wind. So over time, you know, you have savings that materialize for localities because they're not paying as much for energy. Now, this is a really critical but kind of wonky point about how city governments operate in their budgets. The capital budget, how they invest in, you know, hard assets, is managed separately from the operating budget. So the reality is that if you are an entity which is responsible for building a building or providing a building with energy, you basically have to go and get either an appropriation from taxes, or you have to go and raise bonds from the bond market. And there could be other things like fees. But you actually aren't looking at the life cycle costs for most cities. They look at the upfront cost. They don't calculate what they're going to save over time. And that's a huge barrier. So the financial officers of cities aren't managing these budgets. They're looking at, okay, what's our debt load? So it's very hard to make the case. So what NRDC, so bringing it back, and we can go into the discussion, but bringing it back to what NRDC has been forced to do or seen fit to do about these issues is that because of some of the background issues which we're talking about with the federal government, there being a lack of progress, the rollback of, everything that we care about. But even before that, it was pretty obvious that a lot of the action was at the state and local level, because the federal climate policy, even before Trump, was not happening. We failed in 2010 to get climate change legislation passed. Yep. And it's not happening anytime soon. So a lot of actors like the NRDC, like Bloomberg, philanthropies, and other folks have decided that we have to actually look at the local level and combine our traditional policy focus, which is critical, with more implementation, like financing, because you can pass a policy and then it doesn't actually change anything, or people can't afford to implement it. It's going to be watered down, or it's going to be, not complied with. So I'll just touch on one of our major cities project, which we launched last year. We've had a lot of cities projects. Some of them have been around benchmarking of large commercial buildings to know what their energy consumption is, to support things like building code changes. And then, so that work was done, it was called the City Energy Project. We worked with about, I think, 25 cities trying to get large buildings on the path for understanding their consumption and then creating building codes to require that buildings transform, and then also putting in place the ability to finance those changes. That's kind of been, because of that project was so successful, we were able to secure funding to do a much larger project called the American Cities Climate Challenge. And that's something which essentially 25 of the largest emitting cities have put forward some plans to make investments in energy, transportation, and buildings that can allow the US to comply with Paris obligations, even if the federal government isn't going to do anything. And so, just in short order, the project is, we actually, NRDC and partners have catalyzed about 240 different experts to work in 25 cities on all these issues. We're sort of like the conductor with another group out of London called Delivery Associates, whose job is to unblock government, because things get bogged down in government. So it's been really an exciting process. We're just finished year 1 of this project. We can talk about some of the details maybe in the discussion, but you know, the focus that we bring to it is, okay, you have the policy. How do you unblock the decision-making in government to implement the policy? How do you make sure that there's sufficient financing? Because the last thing I'll just say is that the reality is that whole pie of you know, federal government, local government infrastructure, and then the private sector is a big part of this, because I mean, buildings in cities are mostly private buildings. If you put into a new code for buildings, someone's got to pay for it, finance it, and there's equity implications for that too, because you know, low-income housing, affordable housing, you know, schools, these institutions can actually afford to spend more. So we have to always think about how we're impacting the overall system. Is there enough resources? And then, of course, are we measuring the actual impacts? Does it really add up to climate progress or not? So I'll stop there.
That's great. So lots to think about on climate finance, on building coalitions to make sure that the changes that need to be made are well financed. So there's a lot to think about here. I'm going to start with one question for each of our 3 panelists of my own volition. And then we'll move on. And by the way, I will ask the question to each of you, but the others are very welcome to opine as well, because there are many perspectives here. And then after that, I'll move on to questions from all of you, from the audience. And I'm sure there will be plenty, but I have others if needed as well. So I'm going to start with Caitlin at the beginning. Caitlin McCoy. My question for you talked a lot about what individual cities can do from a legal perspective. And many cities are implementing a set of innovative policies, everything from ordinances for natural gas leaks, you discussed much on building standards, which is one area where they do have quite a lot of say. But there are also legal gray areas in here. So some things are very clear. States and cities have, you know, certainly the ability to regulate building energy efficiency. But then there are things that fall in the middle, where it's not quite as clear who has the authority, and the federal government has been, at least in the past few years, has been kind of working to, in some cases, erode that authority. We see this where the Clean Air Act explicitly provides California the authority to regulate fuel economy under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act. I'm not a legal scholar, by the way. I am an economist, but happen to know that one. And so that's a case where the states were actually given the ability to do it, but in one of the recent rulemakings, they said, no, you're not going to be able to do this anymore. And this is obviously going to go to the courts. So that's one example here. But there are many other cases where there are gray areas, where it's actually unclear under our system of federalism who actually has the ability to regulate and or take action in the kind of city and state level. And so my question for you, and as I'm sure you've been thinking about this, is in those gray areas, maybe you can talk a little bit about a few of those gray areas. And in those gray areas, what can be done? What are some of the things that can help make it clear that they're on a solid legal framework in order to take the action that they would like to take?
Good question, and you stole my big example. So of course the rule that you're talking about, which is the first of the safer, affordable vehicles rule, known as the SAFE rule. I'm sorry, no, it's safer, affordable, fuel-efficient vehicles rule, so that we get the full acronym and the George Orwell twist. That was adopted this September, and you're right, it not only changes California's ability to maintain its greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles, but it also takes away the ability of states to have zero emission vehicle programs, which are programs where states set targets or mandates for cars being sold within that state, for a certain percentage of those cars to either be electric or hybrid, and not just to have the free market reign and only 100% internal combustion engine only. So that was one way that states were trying to regulate over the last few years that is now in jeopardy. And as you said, some of these questions are questions that existed for some time, but there wasn't a challenge to be had really in the courts. There wasn't the will for somebody to challenge it. And so they have kind of existed. And now we're going to see a lot of these types of gray areas, I think, increasingly hit the courts as we see the Trump administration seeking out those different gray areas and seeking to impose a federal standard in that area, and also in some places seeking to reinterpret some of our laws and really and make these sort of big sweeping changes to the way that our environmental laws are interpreted. So another big one is around the, I think it's the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, ACE. I often just call it the ACE rule, but it's the rule that replaces the Clean Power Plan. And so in that rule, EPA reinterprets its own authority in a really restrictive way, actually. And so it's the first time this type of interpretation has been before a court, and so it's going to be interesting to see that. So I think ultimately we're just living in really interesting times in terms of environmental law, and in terms of what states can do in light of all of this. It's mostly about California has been a leader in trying to kind of track what the Trump administration is doing and then acting defensively. So one thing, I can think of two examples. One is that the federal government declined to ban a pesticide called chlorpyrifos, which actually, if you were following the news yesterday, you saw that the largest manufacturer of chlorpyrifos has announced it will no longer be making it. But before all of that happened, the federal government announced they won't be banning it. They had previously decided to ban it under the Obama administration. And California decided on its own accord to go ahead and ban the use of the pesticide. And California also saw the changes to the legal jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act coming and acted to change its regulations to protect more wetlands, particularly the wetlands that they knew were kind of in the crosshairs with the proposed rule by the administration. So I think that kind of provides a model for the state looking carefully at the steps that the federal government is taking, looking into those gray areas and doing everything it can within its own regulations. And certainly an area like pesticides is one where California still has the authority to go stricter than the federal government under FIFRA. I'm throwing out all my acronyms and then I'm blanking on the full name. It's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, for those following along at home. So the Trump administration has not yet tried to interpret the cooperative federalism structure under FIFRA to exclude states' abilities to be more restrictive. So that was still an avenue open for them, and the same with the rule on the under the Clean Water Act. So I think, yeah, it's just about being smart to see where are those areas where substantive changes might be proposed, but those bigger interpretations of the law, cutting back state authority, are not in play and acting in those gray areas. That was long-winded.
No,
but
that's great. Would either of you like to follow up? I particularly would like to hear their thoughts about what cities in particular can do. And I know this is a U.S.-specific question. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I mean, I don't have any deep thoughts. I'm not I'm never a legal scholar. I was a lawyer. It's very different. but I think I would point to there's opportunities for states to act together. I would point to the example of the regional RGGI, which is the regional carbon.
Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative.
Thank you, RGGI.
See these acronyms.
Yeah.
It's coming for us today.
Regional Cap and Trade, which is expanding to New Jersey and potentially, I think, Virginia. So I think that, and the thing is, I come back to what I know, of course, but if you can, as I think some of these things that Caitlin was mentioning, like the pesticide, the private markets are actually, in some cases, accelerating beyond the reach of government. So to the extent that we can drive down the cost of some of these technologies, like, the fact that the Chinese essentially made solar viable by subsidizing solar for Germany. Germany bought a lot of it, and then the U.S. benefited from it. They're all benefiting. Similarly, batteries are happening. So the RGGI investments that, or like the state, interesting, there was a challenge to this as well, but the state renewable energy standards, which require procurement of certain quantities of renewable energy, RPS, those have been very, very. I think it's becoming interestingly as time moves forward, the amount of development that's driven by that is shrinking because it's more and more cost competitive. But in the early years, that was a major driver of deployment of renewable energy. So to the extent that states can actually provide frameworks for subsidies or frameworks for innovative financing, they can actually accelerate the adoption of these technologies, drive down the cost, and the Fed's just, last thing I'll say, there's a guy, one of my favorite law professors at Harvard, this guy, David Rosenberg, who was a class action second chair guy who just was the sort of the brains behind class actions. A lot of the early mass torts. And he basically said, car companies cannot make a California car, and they can't make a car for New York. They make one car. And so it was disappointing that Toyota and some of these guys decided to go against California, but most of the car makers were on their side. And the reality is the people who weren't on their side were just behind the curve on developing electric vehicles. So ultimately, again, if coronavirus aside, if Elon Musk is going to be building batteries in China, going to have mega factories in Nevada, Mexico. Ultimately, the battery prices are already dropping. Every time I see a new analysis on lithium battery costs, they always exceed expectations that they had last year. So at the end of the day, we're going to have price parity between ICE engines and electric vehicles in the 2020s. It's a question of is it 2024 or 2025, 2022. So in some sense, it becomes less relevant when those market forces take control.
Great points there. Just to add to that, so some may know that right now the car industry is in a bit of a fight within itself in that several of the major car makers, GM, Toyota, Fiat Chrysler, are on the side of the Trump administration, saying that fuel economy standards should be rolled back, in their view, almost as much as possible, or flatlined, so they're not changing. And then several of the car makers came to a deal with California, which had the fuel economy standards continue to become more stringent over time, and that involved Honda, BMW, Volkswagen, and Ford, which was kind of interesting. So that we had this real break within the industry that's been occurring right now, and I think that's what you were alluding to there.
Thank you for clarifying, yeah.
So really interesting. I want to give Caitlin one more, another shot.
Can I make one comment on that?
Oh, please do, yes.
I find that discussion very interesting. My perception I'm a sociologist. I'm not. I didn't study law. In Europe, it works the other way around. Great Britain, or let's better say England, wanted to get out of the European Union because one reason of the very restrictive environmental standards. So our perception is more the cities are on the level of where you have to act. The problem is how are you going to fill out the possibilities the law gives you, yeah? And not so much I have to fight the state or the federal level to be able to do what I want. Like the environmental legislation in Italy is wonderful. It's wonderful, and it's light years away from what is happening every day. You have the law 10 from 1991 that cities and towns with more than 40,000 inhabitants need to have an energy action plan. Yeah? That was in 1991. And I showed you before that by now in Europe it's 10,000 cities, in Italy it's 4,000, but still there are another 4,000 who don't have a trace of an energy plan. Cities with more than 40,000 inhabitants are obliged by law to have an energy manager. There are a handful who do. They are obliged by law to have a certain percentage of what they buy, the city as a city, public procurement, to be certified environmentally. They are paper always, yeah? Detergents always, but from then on, I'm following with great interest this debate, and I have to see if something like that, I'm not aware, at least in Germany and in Italy, this is not the problem.
Mm. Very interesting.
Refreshing.
Yeah. I wanted to follow up with one last kind of minor question on this theme before we move to another theme here, and back to Caitlin McCoy here is, so say that cities are pushing forward, and they're pushing into that gray area. What should they be concerned about? What should they be doing to try and prepare for the potential blowback that they may face?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in that situation, communication is really important.
Mm-hmm.
If there is a potential conflict on the horizon with the state, then of course it's important for them to sit down with the state and understand, is there a process by which they could somehow get approval to take an action like the one that they're planning, or are they just in a situation where they're going to run smack into conflict with state law? And is the state antagonistic about that? I think it's about trying to collect as much information as they can in the early phases. And we're seeing some of that with relation to the bans on use of natural gas in new construction. California has been very successful. I think 23 cities have adopted these bans, and about 50 more are currently considering them. And that's because it's a feature of California law to allow the states, or to allow the cities to go more restrictive than the state building code. Now, those 23 that have adopted these REACH codes have to actually still go through an approval process. They have to be approved by the California Public Utility Commission, and that will happen this year. So we still kind of are may potentially in limbo, but the California Public Utility Commission has a long history of working with cities to craft these REACH codes, to analyze them, and to ultimately approve them very often. So that's promising. Now, in Massachusetts, the state that I live in, there is one town that has so far adopted a ban like this, and they are potentially going to run into some trouble at the state level. But the state attorney general has said that her office will review the ban and assess whether they can approve it. And so there might be a workaround there. And we know that our Attorney General is very active on the environment, and so that is something that's kind of promising. But there was a recent article that I read that said, Arlington, Newton, Cambridge, all these other cities nearby that would love to adopt something similar to what the town of Brookline has adopted, they're waiting, right? They're waiting to see what this Attorney General's assessment is going to look like. And maybe that's the smart thing to do, is to let another city go forward and It's nice that Brookline is not walking into a really antagonistic situation where they're getting sued by the city or getting sued by the state, but that they're walking into an approval process with the Attorney General's office. That could hopefully be a promising place for dialogue. So I think ultimately what's important is communication and dialogue and avoiding those big, messy, public, litigation-heavy fights to the extent possible, and trying to just creatively craft things and work within the realm of the authority that they have.
I think this is a really interesting area, and it becomes even particularly more interesting when you have cities that are forward-looking and want to be making action in states where it's much more difficult to be making action. So I'm thinking Austin, Texas,
Right.
Bloomington, Indiana. There are quite a few of these examples where they have to be quite cautious in how they move forward for fear of facing the ire of legislators at the state level, as well as the state laws, the way that they're written. So I think you brought up some really, really interesting points in how even in Massachusetts and California, they still have to be cautious about it. I'm going to move on to our next kind of theme here. And this is a question for Karl Ludwig. From the perspective of local governments, often it seems easy to focus your efforts on adaptation. I'm thinking of Venice talking about building a seawall, but there are many other cases where much of the focus is, well, how can we prevent flooding from happening? Should we just adapt by buying up areas that are likely to be flooded in the next storm and those types of things? Sometimes those seem like easier sells than trying to move forward to change parking into bike lanes. And you had talked about biking before and how people perceive of it is really an important aspect to whether you can get acceptance. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about how cities can think about mitigation activities on an even footing or even preferred footing, and sometimes, because if we don't mitigate, we're going to be having to do even more adaptation. And so mitigation is quite important as well, yet seems like this harder sell. And I was curious what your thoughts are on this.
Our experience as a city network is different. We started out, remember the commitment is to reduce CO2 emissions by 10% every 5 years. And we considered all through the 90s and even at the beginning of this century, the discourse on adaptation, discourse for cowards. You are trying to get your own little island in order, and who cares about the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. And we couldn't avoid recognizing that climate change is happening, that it does have, that territories are vulnerable, that it does have impacts, and that we have to prepare for it. That with us came relatively late. I mean, we are talking about 2005, 8. The typical is that the Covenant of Mayors of the European Union on the basis of the climate and energy program of the European Union, climate and energy, is from 2008. Mayors adapt. The corresponding program on adaptation of local entities is from 2014. So all the attention was on mitigation, very little on adaptation. Now, with the new period 2020-2030 and the obligation that all the sustainable energy and action plans, SEAP, they changed to SECAP, Sustainable Energy and Climate Action Plan. So you have to have a part on it on adaptation. And we have big problems with our members to convince them that they should be planning for something which what they have now as planning is insufficient. Mitigation, I mean, then I'd love to hear what you have to say, because in my perception, mitigation is a much easier subject. Why? Because it's an economic activity. You said that before, it's an economic activity, Doug, that often there's a profit. Yeah? Producing energy from renewable sources. Nowadays, wind, offshore, solar, photovoltaic is cheaper than any other way of producing electricity. So that's an economic activity. Energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings, is an economic activity. Life cycle analysis. There, the problems are cultural, that people say, oh, if the payback time is 8 years, 10 years, will I still be alive? Or now, so there are culture. So mitigation, in my experience, it's easier. It's an economic activity. Adaptation only costs. Yeah, it's only cost. I mean, there's nothing potentially that will give you a profit. And then we could go into the whole problem, which I'm not going to go into, that that adaptation is really a very difficult field to the extent to which every assessment report of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I like that you don't use acronyms, is a little more catastrophic than the one before, and you ever more have the feeling that you have to plan for events that are unforeseeable, and that renders adaptation a very complex and difficult field.
Very interesting. Different perspective, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think adaptation is very hard for a number of different reasons, and I mean, if you look at the cash flows which have gone to adaptation versus mitigation globally, adaptation is much less, and there's a lot of reasons. One is that it's, I mean, one thing which is actually very underappreciated, even among people who think about it all the time, is that even when the political leadership and the agency heads say, oh, we should be more resilient and we should be adaptive, the engineers don't know how to do it because it's not actually in the code. They follow the code. And I recently befriended this engineer who's head of sustainability for Los Angeles Metro, which controls all the transportation in Los Angeles, plus owns roads. And basically, he's like, the engineers look at what's in the code, and the code does not incorporate essentially concepts of these concepts and the data they looked at. So what's happening now? The International Association of Mechanical Engineers is actually doing the first sustainability code for engineers. Because even if all the investors say we want this, no one knows how to build it, it's not going to happen. Other thing is in the US in particular around coastal resilience is that the federal government actually is the one insuring these disaster areas. And the federal government actually doesn't pay their rules for compensating landowners actually make them rebuild the same thing in the same way in the same place. So we're fighting that a lot. It's an absurd thing.
Absurd.
So the only actor that has an incentive to actually make things more resilient, well, maybe a couple, but is the insurance industry.
Yeah.
And the insurance industry, because they have to pay out way more than they expected. But how you're able to get those considerations baked into design decisions and decisions of planning way upstream is what the sort of challenge is for that. And also the federal government, a lot of that hardening work, like New York City where I live, I mean, when Sandy hit, all these things happened and all that grant money came through, but without that grant money, it's very hard to finance these kinds of massive undertakings. And then as Karl was saying, at the building level, yes, there's payback periods, there's cash flow issues, there's not understanding what needs to be done based on the data that we have. So there's just a lot of issues. But I will say, I think that the adaptation, and also I'll say that people like NRDC, for a long time, were very hesitant to admit that we needed to do that because I was saying that we sort of lost the battle. But everyone's on board. We all see it happening now. And I think that what we need to be thinking about is how do we combine mitigation and adaptation policy together, such that which would create another political opportunity potentially in the U.S. because we wouldn't be always saying, oh, we want to have a carbon tax. Can we do something which actually marries those two and allows different parts of the country to benefit from those policies and see their own issues in those policies?
I'm really glad that Doug just mentioned that idea of combining, because if you remember at the beginning, when I was kind of talking through that list of different sectors that I focus on, one of them I mentioned is urban forestry, which seems a little odd from a mitigation perspective because the amount of mitigation that you can get by planting a bunch of trees is actually not that much, despite what you may have heard from the 1 trillion trees project mentioned in our State of the Union on Tuesday. Crazy that was just earlier this week. A lot of time feels like it's gone by. Every day is so long. So it's not that I, think that trees are the solution, right, to mitigating carbon in an urban environment, but planting trees in an urban environment produce all these incredible, often adaptive co-benefits. I mean, just looking at this building that we're in now, I'm watching all of the trees blowing in the wind, but all of these trees here reduce the amount of the cooling load that needs to happen inside of this building, and even the heating load by breaking the wind. And so that is like an energy efficiency feature actually out there that is pretty low cost. Of course, we have the maintenance of those trees, but they also provide all of these other fantastic benefits if there are people walking around, particularly in urban environments where there aren't a lot of shade. When we have increasing temperatures, it makes it more comfortable for people to walk, for people to wait outdoors for public transit when there's shade, particularly as we, like I said, experience hotter days, and we also maybe want people to walk more or to take public transit more because we know that that's lower emission system for people to move. And so that is one of the areas that I've included in my work, not because I think, like I said, it's a big bang for the buck in terms of mitigation, but it has all these fantastic adaptive co-benefits, and I think it needs to be part of the mix. So that's just like an example of one of those things.
That's great. Well, I'm going to move now to my third question, which actually follows pretty clearly from the other two. We have a wealth of knowledge here on this panel on how to get cities together to form alliances, and just amazing work that's been done to really bring many groups together. And it does raise a question though, because many of these groups get together, they make commitments, and these commitments sometimes are very ambitious commitments, and that's really exciting and really great, and targets are very, very important. My question is, and this is for Douglas Sims, is asking, what types of things can be done to help assure that these targets are credible targets that are actually being met? What types of things can we do along the way, for example, to both enable cities to kind of meet the targets that they've set, but also to ensure that they're not just aspirational targets, but that they're true targets that actually lead to meaningful differences in the end? And I know that's a tough question.
Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted question, that's for sure. I think there's maybe at least two buckets of things that can be done, maybe three, but I'm not sure. But the one is, obviously, if you are a citizen and advocate, you have to keep the pressure on, because we spend a lot of time getting people to commit to doing things, and then we have to spend a lot of time tracking them and making sure that they do it, and because when the election comes around, we haven't forgotten what happened. I mean, that's a really important thing, and there's a whole communication side, and that's accountability, I guess I would call that bucket. But then there's almost the equally or not more important bucket for actual change, because if someone's cheating on climate, we lose. I mean, we have to find out how real it is. It's yes, there's monitoring and tracking, but I think to start that process, you have to start it in the city, in our region, very, very far what we call upstream in the planning phase, because these are systems, right? These are massive systems, and it takes years to change these systems. So you can't, I'll give you an example. So I work in an area, I think something called green bonds. Green bonds are essentially when investors say, we want to have green, and we're not going to, and if you do green, we want you to tell us what green is, and measure the emissions, and blah, 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 blah. That's all great, but that process is at the very end of the process. Once you've designed and planned infrastructure system, the last thing you do is finance it. So that act, cannot influence that front unless it's happened way earlier. And right now, that's not been happening. So one thing we've been doing, we have something called the High Road Project, which essentially is a project which looks at what has to be done to have different decisions made at every level in a city to have climate resilient, low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure come out the back end of that pipeline. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing that we need to do actually is to create a framework at the executive level, the mayoral level, that says, here are our goals, and that's not enough. You actually have to have those high-level goals translated into operational requirements at the agency level of cities. I mean, you have to, so every single, so what happens to the city basically is that there's a capital budget, and there's a bunch of projects that are listed on that budget, and there's some money that can pay for those projects. Typically the ones that are urgent, police stations, fire stations, potholes, they come first. But everything else, like energy efficiency, that comes last. So unless you change the way you prioritize those capital priorities, you're not going to change what comes out of the pipe. And so we've looked at cities that have been successful in doing that. Essentially, you have a screen which says, okay, you want your project to be put in line. Okay, shows that you've done the GHG analysis. Shows that you've done the analysis on equity, on how it impacts underserved communities. Shows the impact on resilience and adaptation. Or you don't get funded, or you go to the back of the line. And then there's a whole bunch of things which, then you have to go, the next step to that is, okay, so you're doing that's all been done, and you're gonna go out and you're gonna figure out, okay, we wanna build this thing. So you have to put that in the procurement process. So if you're gonna go out to the procurement, I wanna buy some trucks, or I wanna buy some cement, I wanna buy some this or that, those documents have to have requirements that the contractors do that. And then you have to monitor that they have to actually do that. Then you have to track how that's performing. I mean, it's a whole thing. And it changes the entire functioning of how city government works. So I think that both of those pieces, like the political piece where the mayor says this is happening, and it pushes through the system, and then people on the outside say, okay, well, you know what, we're looking at you too. And so if you don't do it, we're going to say that you didn't do it when you come up for election. And that's what I think the two pieces need to be.
That's great. Do either of you have further thoughts on this question?
Well, I think Doug covered it.
We should remember that the commitments are voluntary commitments. Climate protection is not a duty of city administrations. But we should also remember that's true also on a global level, like the Kyoto Protocol or also the Paris Agreement. The nationally determined contributions, NDC, it's already the countries that decide how much they are going to reduce, and if they don't do it, so the only really force I see is to blame and to shame. What you said, the outside forces that look, and the discrepancy between what you said and what you promised and what you are doing. The monitoring the CO2 emissions is a very good indicator, and many cities do that routinely. But I would think that cheating on climate means, and that should become, and that's again more from the outside than you can expect from inside the city government. Cheating on the climate means cheating on the citizens, because if it's true what I said before, that reducing CO2 emissions improves the quality of life in the city, those trees are not only improve the energy efficiency of this building, but they're also agreeable to the eye. If you walk, you enjoy having these trees. So cheating on the climate is cheating on the quality of life of citizens, and to the extent to which this becomes clear, one would hope, because as I said, commitment targets, Credible actually said, are they true targets? there are no sanctions which at least I see. And the potholes obviously have the priority there to get across the idea that reducing CO2 emissions, climate protection as part of the daily functioning. So if there are potholes, means maybe you constructed too many streets and you are not able to maintain them because in some euphoric attack in the 70s or 80s, you built all those streets. Perhaps you should simply rebuild some of those streets and turn them into gardens or whatever. I'm being a little utopian. But to rebuild streets is actually happening. So that with your normal functioning as a city government, you can do climate policies, and the funds that you'll have from the European Union, from the Green New Deal, if it ever should come about, yeah, they serve for those solutions that to fill the gap what the market does not support, but not for daily climate policies.
Can I add one small thing to that?
Yeah.
So I think this is more of an observation than I mean, I think there is an increasing appreciation that cities that don't deal with this issue will get penalized by the markets.
Yeah.
So, you know, S&P, Moody's, the rating agencies which rate the city's debt, they have acknowledged that places like, you know, Cape Town, which had a massive water crisis, California, which had the wildfires. I mean, PS Pacific Gas and Electric was the first climate bankruptcy. You know, this is a public utility, which should be a relatively stable set of, you know, they have regulated cash flows, and yet they, you know, this level of the devastation caused by their failure to maintain their systems just overwhelmed their reserves and all their access to the capital. So the investors, even something like BlackRock, you know, which is a major, I think it's 1.6 trillion under management. They're saying that they want all of their investees. Now, this is, you know, mostly companies, to disclose climate risk. Like, what have you guys looked at it? Do you know what you're exposed to? Your supply chains, your facilities, all that. So that kind of downside risk gets attention very quickly. More than saying, oh, we're going to build some more trees. No, you know, if you don't do it, you're going to have a higher interest rate on your debt. You won't have access to the capital markets. And that's unfortunately what gets people's attention, whether they're cities or companies.
So it sounds like it's verification, transparency, peer pressure and co-benefits, including the benefits to their bottom line through whether they can put out bonds, particularly green bonds, and as well as co-benefits to the people. So those all sound like that must be the secret sauce there. If only all cities could do it. I now want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I imagine there'll be several. Do we have mics that can come around?
There were some here. I'm not seeing them now.
Okay. Well, there will be some mics. But there they are. So we have some mics that will come around, and please stand up if you have any questions. You can direct the question to someone or direct it to the entire panel. I only ask that you keep your question relatively brief, and more of a question than a comment would be the preference. Please. We have a first one.
Someone right there.
Well,
I think it's on.
Please turn it on.
Better?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
You were talking about infrastructure finance, and how do you bring, or how do we bring, bond council, rating agencies, and the like into the discussion? In some ways, it's the flip of climate risk.
I think the rating agencies are already there. Oh, here's the basic problem with. Here's the problem. I guess my answer is they're already in the discussion. Maybe not bond council so much, but certainly the rating agencies are right there. I was mentioning before green bonds. So I'm on what's called the Standards Board of something called the Climate Bonds Initiative. It's a NGO based in London, which essentially promulgates scientifically based standards for what is green, including what is low carbon and what is resilient. And it also certifies bonds as you need to be a verifier, and you kind of like an accountant looks at your whole bond documentation and the underlying evidence, and then it says, okay, it's certified green bond. It costs some money. I mean, it costs, depending on what the asset is, between $5,000 and $50,000. And that's great. There's a growing market, but it's still very small. The green bond market is a very small part of the overall market. Okay, so why is that? One is because the market has not seen a difference consistently in how the benefits to the issuers in terms of like lower costs of doing something green. So until that, so every time you go to see a CFO to say, hey, just do more green bonds, they say, well, why would I do a green bond? You know, there's no benefit to me. I mean, some of the large entities like New York City or like, you know, SF, Public Utility Commission, you know, sovereign bonds, France, Chile, for them, it's fine. But if you're a small place, you know, you can't afford to spend 50 grand on something like this. So, and the bond issuers, I mean, the Issuers Council, they are concerned about green claims, a green default. They're saying, you know what, you say you're doing this thing, you don't do it, or maybe it's not as green as you said it is. You know, there's the idea that that's a default under the indenture is for them is a real possibility, and they don't want any risk attached to that. So how we are engaging with groups of Issuers Council, and there's all kinds of working groups. I think at the regulatory level, there's a broader discussion about fiduciary duty and how that plays into looking at green issues, which will, I think, influence that discussion. And then on the regulatory side, you know, there's, you know, stock markets and central banks are starting to say, you know what, this is really material. So I think it's moving in that direction, but it's got to be sort of bottom up and top down, and again, pushing from the side.
Great. Yes, we have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Sangri from the City of Baltimore Law Department, and I've just gone through the exercise with our bond counsel because we're getting ready now for our annual putting together the book of what risks the city is exposed to, which will then form the basis for all the bonds, the general operating bonds and things going forward during the year. And initially, our finance department, who hate lawyers, so they didn't want to hear from us. And also our outside bond counsel, our inside bond counsel, all thought, oh, this is driven by the litigation that I'll be speaking about tomorrow, our climate damages suit, and you should not be saying anything about our bond disclosures. But we collected from around the country the climate disclosures that various cities are now making in their bond offerings, and it's not just cities that have litigation, it's not just coastal cities, but it's, you know, cities all across the country are starting to disclose climate risks that they're facing, whether it be rivers flooding or heat waves, you know, or, you know, various infrastructures being overloaded by torrential rains, et cetera. So it's starting to happen.
Okay. That's good.
Question over here.
Thank you. So here in New Haven, we have about 70% thereabouts rental properties, and much of that is occupied by low middle income renters. The housing stock is quite old, so there's a fertile ground there for deep renovations. I guess I'm speaking to Caitlin McCoy primarily, but are there ways of, in your mind, stimulating on a voluntary basis landlords, landowners, property owners to undertake such projects over and above or without having to follow codes that may or may not be up to current standards, or anyway, are there voluntary ways of stimulating, providing incentives to landowners to undertake deep energy retrofits?
Well, I will toss the question eventually to Doug because he's the expert, I think, in that realm of financial incentives, but I'll say a couple of things. First, yeah, this idea of what's called the split incentive is a big problem when you have big buildings with a lot of tenants, because the owner who would be making those investments is not going to reap the benefit of those lower energy bills. It's the tenants that are going to get that benefit. And particularly perhaps in a market like this where you get so much turnover, it's not that you have a tenant who's with you for 10 or 20 years and who's very grateful for that, and there's a way that you can kind of build that in to the rent. But the Netherlands has a very interesting model for this problem, where they basically allow the owner of a building, like a large apartment building with tenants, to actually charge like a small fee per month for like to balance out the idea of the split incentive, so that the tenants don't get this like windfall of energy savings essentially at the owner's expense, that there is like more balance there. And to the question about renovations, as I kind of briefly touched on it, there are some different models for mandating renovations. That's more kind of what I'm knowledgeable about, so we'll get to incentives in a second. But in terms of mandating them, different cities have different ways of doing things, or different states have different ways of doing things. One, the city of Austin has experimented with every single time a property is sold, it needs to undergo an energy audit and potentially a retrofit. And so there was a time, and this was actually several years ago, it was like in the early 2000s, when they put pretty much every property through this city through this program. And then there is another way of doing things, which is that once you undertake a renovation project in a building, once you pass either a certain cost threshold, usually set by like a certain percentage of the building value. So if you undertake a renovation project that has you spending more than 25% of what that building is worth, you need to bring the entire building up to code. And the same is true if you're undertaking a renovation that basically crosses a threshold in terms of square footage. So if you're doing, you know, maybe something that's 20% of the building footprint in a renovation, it won't be triggered. But once you get past like 30%, 40% of the building square footage that's being renovated, then all of a sudden the whole building needs to come up to code. And so that's something, for example, that Chicago and actually the entire state of Illinois uses, just as a couple examples. But in terms of sweetening the pot with some fantastic incentives, pushing some voluntary things, I'm going to hand that off.
Well, I mean, I do know a little bit about it. I mean, I think, fortunately you're in Connecticut, because Connecticut Green Bank, which is, you know, a public bank, which we work with for many years very closely, is a real leader in this area. So the single family market is even tougher than sometimes the multifamily market for low income, because, you know, or the, you know, 3 or 4 families rental New Haven property. So, but we actually have a big paper on this. It's called How are Green Banks Helping Affordable Housing? And essentially, there are known barriers, upfront costs as usual, understanding of the technology, belief that the savings will manifest, the cost of an energy audit. There's a series of things that are there. And so, and I guess the other two pieces are, it's kind of like what Kate was alluding to, the times when it's most easy to do an energy efficiency upgrade are when you're doing something else to the building. So if you're doing a, you know, obviously if it's a new building, the code drives what is built. If it's a major retrofit or a major renovation, the incremental cost of doing a retrofit actually is quite small. So what the strategies that have been put in place are, in broad strokes, is that use the network of lenders, because lenders are the ones who know when someone wants to get a loan. And so when someone's coming up to get a new mortgage or a refinancing, the lenders need to be educated that they can do they can get a loan for energy efficiency. And the green banks and others, or the utilities themselves, have pools of money, which can be grant money, or it can be low interest loans, where they make that available to the lenders for the energy portion of the renovation. That's a big one sort of class of things that are done. Another one is, in the case of people who want some solar. Solar, in some sense, is sexier than energy efficiency. A lot of times, the contractors who are selling solar, going door to door, do you want solar? You can actually get those guys to try to understand energy efficiency and get them to market efficiency to the people they're selling these panels to. And then they can go back to the Connecticut Green Bank and get special grants or other things that lower the cost of that. The last thing I'll mention is that, I'm not sure what, I think it's called PSI, I'm not sure what it's called. There's some program in Connecticut which is targeting, I think this is mostly for solar, but targeting low-income solar. It's a subsidy for solar. And, but of course, and it's actually it's a tax credit type, so you pay less taxes. A lot of these buildings don't have a lot of tax burden, so what value is that? So what the Green Bank has done is they've created essentially a mechanism for investors to buy those tax benefits. So if you're like someone who wants to develop a neighborhood, refinance a group of houses somewhere in Connecticut, you can get 20 low-income houses, you can put them together, and you can get a tax investor to essentially say, I'll give you money to do it in exchange for you giving me these tax things you can't use. That's actually quite a powerful way. So it's not a simple answer, I'm sorry, but there's a number of things which I'll just summarize by saying, which target the specific barriers that block these homeowners from doing these retrofits, and intervene, use the networks of people who are aware when something's happening in a building to get them to let the state or the Green Bank know that, hey, this needs to be done.
A lot of exciting ideas there. I too have a paper on split incentives and energy efficiency, and it does make a difference. I think we have time for roughly one, maybe two, if we're lucky, more questions.
All right.
So we see two here. Please go ahead.
Hi, Eric Weiner from Windsor Climate Action. This is a law school 101 question, quite naive. How is it that the Trump administration has been able to change such fundamental concepts through a rulemaking system when I would have expected some of these programs would have been codified in statute, that would have had to go through a legislative process? And it's just been quite shocking, and I don't understand.
Yeah, so I'm happy to give the rundown. So our statutes, if you actually sit down and open up the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, what you'll find is something that's written in pretty broad strokes, right? And it says often they begin, of course, with very lofty statements of purpose. We should have clean air, and the way that we should do this is by controlling the discharges out of industrial facilities. But it doesn't actually get into all the detail of how exactly the government is going to go about doing these things, and how exactly the permit programs will function. Often they'll have like some threshold things in there. I mean, the Clean Air Act is more detailed than other statutes, but where you get all of the detail is inside the regulations. And so those are created through the rulemaking process. So they'll either be referred to as rules or regulations. And those are basically taking the pieces of the statute as a jumping off point and interpreting them to create then a whole realm of all of the regulatory programs that we have. And that's where you get not only these substantive programs that actually are the programs that give out permits for these facilities, but you actually get interpretations of the main statute inside of them. And what's important is Often these interpretations can change over time. Often these programs can change over time from one administration to the next. But where it becomes problematic is, and this is like getting a little into the weeds here, is where you have the administration saying this is the only possible reading of the statute. Not just, hey, we've got one possible reasonable interpretation of the statute, and we're going to go ahead and craft this regulatory program based on that. That can easily be changed in the future then. The problem comes in where you have the administration saying this section, Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, can only be interpreted one way, and it is this way. And then the issue is when that hits the courts, whether you get a court that agrees with that or not. And then if a court does agree with that and say this section of the Clean Air Act can only be read one way, then we can't undo that with a different regulation or rule in the future. That is now an interpretation of the underlying statute. And the only way we can undo that is by modifying the statute itself. And so really what we have in terms of unmovable things are the statutes themselves and our court interpretations of the statutes. Now, in terms of our rules and regulations, agency interpretations that are said to just be possible or reasonable, all of that is subject to movement. But the Trump administration has engaged in some of that. This is the only possible reading. And the question is a court going to agree with them?
Then the only other alternative is through the legislative process.
Right, we would
Right,
have
new
to have
statutes.
Congress amend the underlying environmental statutes, which I don't even need to say, but it would be an uphill battle. Hardly need to say it, it's implied. Okay, good, I'm glad.
Excellent explanation. Please, last question.
Can I just speak? Is it okay if I don't lose the microphone?
If everyone can hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
So my question is, actually, let me start off by saying I'm a junior at Southern, right down the road, and I've just recently become involved in climate advocacy. I do aspire to be a climate scientist someday, so that is my goal, but for right now, I am very heavily involved in climate advocacy. And my question is, considering how inextricably linked Yale University is to the New Haven area, I'm not going to act like I know everything about the economics involved in that. I just know that Yale is heavily invested in fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel activities, and that has been something that I've been very avid about advocating against and advocating for divestment. But I want to ask how important anyone thinks it is for Yale to divest in fossil fuels for the continued implementation of sustainable concepts in cities. Sorry, I'm terrible at phrasing things. Thank you.
We can have brief answers. I mean, we are just about out of time, and that is a question that requires potentially a lot of discussion. Not a problem at all, but honestly,
I'll give you a brief answer.
Should feel free to answer.
I think it depends as a individual matter in terms of like depriving those companies of Yale's money. It's not going to impact those companies if Yale itself decides it'll divest. That being said, the overarching if Yale and Harvard and institutions are divesting, you essentially are taking away the social license to operate and access money to these companies. So as part of a movement, it can be very impactful when big institutions, even if they have a small pool of money relative to the entire universe of money, take this action. It's got a lot of power, and they're influencing much bigger actors. So like if you're in the divestment movement, you may have heard that this very mysterious company called BlackRock said this, pretty interesting thing. It wasn't the be all and end all, but it was very big for them. But the reason why that they did that was because a lot of advocates and other companies that they invest on behalf of told them they need to be doing that. So Yale will be very powerful if it were to do that, in my opinion.
Any other quick thoughts, or shall we?
I was going to say, I'm proud to say that my alma mater, the University of California, has divested.
Yeah.
Well, with that, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for an amazing panel. Please give